John, do we have any questions?
Well, let me start with workload placement. We at Nemertes have spent a long time talking about this and looking at this, having workload placement processes, being an important part of working in a multi-cloud environment. Uh, can you speak to some best practices associated with figuring out where to put the next workload and why?
Yeah, so there are a couple of variables when it comes to workload placement. One is definitely security. Next would be performance. Security is obviously top of mind for everybody. So if you have the right command control and security posture, meaning firewalls, identity access, and reporting in place in all of your clouds, then next would become performance. Where will the application perform best, whether it's access to the end user or access to the data that it requires to run. And that will largely depend on, do I need to move this application into one cloud or the other? Do I need to bring additional components of this application closer to the data so that it can run the way it needs?
Uh, Earlier, we had a presenter talking about costs, and I would think that might be another important consideration.
Yep. Yeah. So FinOps is becoming very, very important. So especially as certain platforms, certain clouds become more or less expensive, we want to make sure we do have a good idea of how much an application will cost. We can model this very well on-prem. We tend to know how much our private clouds will cost. As applications start to expand into the public clouds, having a good idea of how much the total cost of your data and compute will be is very important.
Um, Honestly, I might still take issue with the idea that people know how much things cost inside their own data centers on a workload by workload basis, anyway. But I wanted to dig in a little bit on security too, because beyond protecting the workloads, there's the consideration of compliance.
Yep.
And do you fold that into the idea of security, or is that another axis on which to make decisions about placement?
It should be considered with, especially if there's a workload that is clearly defined. While maybe not relevant to this team, things like HIPAA guidelines, for multinationals, things like GDPR and data governance, we definitely need to take that under consideration. And that's all about your data security and placement. If you have workloads where you will be fined if it leaves a border of a given country or crosses into another country, we want to make sure when we're deploying that workload or protecting that workload into a DR or bunker type solution, we keep that in mind. We also things like PCI DSS. Can we abide by these well-known standards? But more importantly, yes, we know them. Yes, we're audited on them on a regular basis. But how can we do continuous remediation when applications are deployed? Can we ensure that this application is deployed to meet these standards? If for some reason something flags against known baselines, how quickly can I remediate that? I think one of the previous presenters was talking about past high CVEs, CVE 10s. When a CVE 10 comes out, one, everyone becomes concerned about it. But the longer it takes you to remediate that, you may also open yourselves up to unintended fines and consequences. So, having platforms where you can visualize what may or may not be impacted by it, and then quickly being able to remediate against it.
Yeah, that idea of knowing the vulnerability map across all your environments, I think it's hugely important as the space around CVEs and vulnerabilities generally gets more litigious. Um, so you focused a lot on transitioning into a fully developed cloud model
hmm
where everything that you do is basically delivered as a service to your customers internally, inside IT, outside IT. Um, what are some practical considerations that people should keep in mind when they're thinking about transitioning storage to be a service or infrastructure to be a service?
Yeah. So, inside most data centers or current sets of infrastructure, we have a lot of tools to manage our environment. When we start moving to an as a service model, having multiple tools is not an ideal state. We want to try and simplify the portfolio of platforms or UIs that our teams need to manage this infrastructure. Because as we start to try and deliver it at speed or as a service to our end users, the more tools we have, the more areas that we'd have to figure out how to integrate with. If we simplify that stack into as few tools as possible, then we can simply point the automation endpoints to one or few places, and then we can start delivering things quickly as a service. So if I need a database, and I have to automate the deployment of compute, deployment of storage, the automated deployment of my operating system and my database engine. That's a lot of tools that I'd have to figure out how to automate and include in a pipeline. But if I have one tool to collapse the compute and storage and maybe deployment of a virtual machine, and then I just have a few options or settings to further automate the deployment of my engine, that becomes a lot easier of a task.
Yeah, agreed. I was talking earlier about the need to simplify the tool stack as much as you can because there's going to be plenty of things pushing you to add more tools to it all the time.
Yep.
So yeah, I certainly want to reinforce that message. Simplify. If no other reason presents itself to your mind for why to simplify that portfolio, think of it all as technical debt. Every tool you have that you don't need is debt that you are incurring needlessly. And so you got to devote some effort to get yourself out of debt.
Yes, 100% agree.
Well, with that, I think we're ready to take on our next speaker. So, Joe, thank you again for being here today. Thank you so much for this wonderful sharing of knowledge.